All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to another online meetup. I'm just gonna wait a few seconds for folks to join. Let me see here. All right, well, we can get started. So welcome again. My name is Max Katz, and I head education in the community for Okta Workflows. And this is Okta Workflows online meetup. And the topic today is understanding Okta Workflows connectors. And so specifically, we're going to talk about the pre-built connectors, the API connector card, and then also I'm going to show you a connector build with the connector builder. I'm going to see examples for each of the categories that I mentioned. And I know it kind of sounds maybe confusing because there's too many words with the word connector in it. But I'm hoping after this session, it will be a lot more clear. So before we jump in, so this event is being recorded, and the replay will be available right after we end the session, right on Crowdcast, and then tomorrow it will also be on YouTube. And then I'll send a link with the, I'll send a message with a link to YouTube and whatever other resources I mentioned in this meetup tomorrow, right? So that's, if you have any questions, please, you can put them in chat. There's also a separate Q&A section, so you can ask there as well. Let me see if there are any questions. I don't see any questions. All right. Then let's get started. Now, also at the bottom of the screen, you see a green button and it says Understanding Okta Workflows Connectors. So there is a blog post. And so this online meetup is based on this blog post. Let me show you. Then if you need to go back after the session and just kind of read about the connector. So this is again, it's on the Okta blog, so you can check it out. And again, I'll include it in the message that I send tomorrow. All right. Oh, you know what? You probably can't see that because I'm not. I have to move this up. Sorry, I apologize. I'll do this again. Here we go. Sorry. I know I wasn't showing the screen and but the blog is right here. And again, it's linked from the bottom of your screen, but it's on the Okta. It's on the Okta blog. All right. So Okta connector. So I've built a number of examples here, so I'm going to use to kind of get into Okta workflows connectors. So first, I'm going to open this flow, Okta 1. All right. And now, so when you're starting with Okta workflows, it is very likely when this is you're building your first flow, it's very likely you're going to be using the pre-built connectors. Okay, and what are the pre-built connectors? Well, when you go to Add App Action, you'll see a list of all the available pre-built connectors. All right, so you can see there is a list. So they're available for you. There's nothing you need to do. They're available out of the box in Okta workflows. Now, a connector behind the scenes, those are API endpoints that Okta workflows makes available for you for the specific connector. So let me open Okta, and you can see the connector has all these actions. Now, every action is an API endpoint, okay? But it's just the higher abstraction level. You need to worry about setting up the API call, the request parameters, or the body, or the query, sorry, the headers. Everything is everything is done behind the scenes for you. So this is for Okta. And then let's say you want to use Gmail. So then the Gmail connector has these actions. Okay, and again, behind the scenes, these are API calls, but you don't need to worry, as I said, setting up the API call. So right here, I have an action. I'm using the Okta connector, and I'm using the read user action. Okay, and you can see that I specify it requires an ID or a login, so I specify the ID. Okay, now, but of course, I need to authenticate as well. Okay, and so the authentication is right here. If I need to, I can create a new connection. So there's a connector, right? And then you can create multiple connections to the connector. Now you can create multiple connections. That allows you to have a connection to the development environment, to the production environment, or testing environment. So you have one connector and you can create multiple connections to a connector. So in my example here, I have two connections to Okta, right? And again, you can create as many as you need. Every connector is going to have a slightly different setup steps to create the connection, right? Some will use an API key. Some connectors might use a basic authentication, and then some connectors will use OAuth like authentication. Okay, and then you would click new connection, and then in this particular, for Okta specifically, right, you would need to specify the client ID and the client secret. So you go to the Okta admin console and you get that information. For something else, for like Gmail, if I use, for example, add an action, send email. So I've got two connections here, but if I create a new one and then give it a description, click create, it's going to open a pop-up. I don't know if you can see this, but it's basically asking me, do you want to, let me see if you can see it on the screen here. It's probably not sharing my screen, but it's basically, it's like a login with Google type authentication. And then you accept, and then workloads will have access to your Google account. All right, but let me go back here and let me run this. Let me run this. All right, and so I test, right? So I enter the ID for a user, and this is the result that I get back. So again, this is using one of the built-in connectors, which is Okta, and then I have a connection to Okta, and then I can call the action. And again, I know I said this before, but behind the scenes, it's calling an API endpoint, right? So this is the option number one when we use the pre-built connectors, and then you use one of the actions. Okay, so that's option number one. So let me go back to my folder. Let me save. Okay, so I'm going to open Shopify. So Shopify is another connector or pre-built connector that's available. So if I Shopify is right here. So there's a Shopify connector, and then these are the actions that the connector supports. Okay, and I've got one of the actions right here is to create a customer. Now, again, I have a connector, and then I created a connection to Shopify right here. Now, let me go open the portal. This is the Shopify admin portal, and you can see I have 4 users. Let me just refresh. Okay, and if I want to call this action, I'm going to test the card directly. I'm going to click test this card, and I've got the user information. I'm going to click test, and this is the response from the action or from the behind the scenes from the API, and then it tells me that a user was created. I can close. Let me refresh the admin console. And now you can see that user Maya was created. right? Now, so very similar. There's a pre-built connector, and I'm using one of the available actions with that connector. Okay, but let's go back. Now, what I want to do next is I want to let's say I want to count how many customers I have, right, in my in Shopify, right? So I go back to the connector and I select Shopify. Shopify. Also, just to give you kind of a the all apps, these are all the connectors, and then this section here where it says connected apps, these are all the connectors for which you have a connection. Okay, so that's why Shopify is here. So I look at Shopify and I want to count how many customers I have, and I look through this list and I don't see such action. Okay, so it's just not available as part of the connector. Now, but if I look at the Shopify docs, which is oh, here, it's actually selected. So it says retrieves account of customers. If I go to Shopify docs, I do see such endpoint, but the connector doesn't expose this endpoint as an action. So, but luckily what I can do is that all connectors have an action called custom API action. So if I go back to my Shopify, and then every connector will have this. If I go to Shopify, custom API action, and it says make an authenticated HTTP request to the Shopify REST API. So then what it allows me to do, it allows me to specify the endpoint. And so this allows me to call any API point available on the connector, or really any API endpoint available in Shopify. But although I do specify the API endpoint, I don't need to set up the authentication because I can reuse the connection that I created before, right? And that's what you see here. So notice I use the connection, but I do specify the endpoint. And if the endpoint requires extra parameters, I can do that. So if I'm not showing those fields here, but if I go choose fields, I can show query and headers. So if this particular endpoint required more, information via query or the headers, I could provide that. So again, this allows me to call any API endpoint, but reuse the existing connection. So if I test, then I get 5, right? So I get 5 customers, right? Now, and then in a similar fashion, let's say I want to return all the customers that I have. If I look to the Shopify connector, I don't really have an action here that just returns a list of customers. But if I go back to Shopify and there is an actually endpoint retrieves a list of customers, right? And that's what I want to use, right? So right here, customers.json, that's sort of the. So I go back to workflows, and what I do is I specify it's a relative URL. So notice that it's a relative URL. I specify the endpoint. It doesn't require query or headers, and I can click test. Right? And I get back 5 customers. All right. All right. So this was the second option, right? So you've got a connector, and you can use any of the out of the box actions. Right? That was the first example. I also showed you the same here with the create customer. But now, if there are any endpoints that you want to use, but they're not exposed as an action on the connector, then you can use the custom API action. And then specify the endpoint, but reuse the authentication or the connection. Right? So that's option number 2. Okay. Let's exit. Let me save. Let me see if there are any questions first. Cool. I don't see any questions. So let's go to the third example. All right. Okay. Now, so I've got the connectors, and that's great, right? And if I need to use an API from one of the connectors, perfect. But now I found an API that I want to use, and that's coming from an API called Ship Engine. And I go back to Okta and I search, and Ship Engine is not here, right? So there is no connector available for Ship Engine. So can I call an API? Yes, absolutely. And the way this is done is that there is a card called API connector. So it's kind of a generic card. If you scroll all the way to the bottom, it's right here, API connector. It's also available from the function. If I go to function, API connector, and then I can select which method I want to call, right? So I can do a get, I can do a post, for example. And that's what I'm doing here, is that I'm doing a post. And so this allows me to call any API that's out there, right? If it's not available as a pre-built connector, I can use this card to call any API, okay? Now, but with this particular case, you need to specify of course, the endpoint, all the parameters, the headers, the body, the query, and you do need to set up authentication as well, right? Because it's just a generic card. And so let me show you what it does. This one I am validating an address. It's an API to validate an address. So this is my address. This is the body, and it goes right here. And then for the authentication, if I go to Ship Engine and I go to authentication, it uses an API key. Okay, and so I go back and then I set up an API key. This is the parameter and this is the value. So I'm using object construct. You can always test and just see how it looks. It creates this JSON object, and then I'm passing it into the headers for the API call. All right, so let's run this. All right, and it works. I get back that the address was verified here. All right. So now this is the third example, or the third case, right? That if you find an API that's not available there's no pre-built connector in Okta workflows, I mean, that's not a problem, because you can use the API connector card to call that API, right? But you do need to set up the query, the headers, the body, and the connection as well. Okay. Now, if you see that you use this a lot, right? There's this API that you use a lot. You can save the connection information into a connection and then reuse it. Okay, so let me show you what I mean by that. So notice here it says none, and say I use I use to validate an address often. So what I can do is, instead of setting up the header every single time, the API key, what I can do is I'm going to copy this and I'm going to create a connection, right? And I'm going to call this Ship Engine. Call this one. And then here you can select the authentication type, right? And so this one uses custom because it uses an API key, and you have to, this is the API key. Let me just double check if this is correct. Yes, this is the header parameter name. And then I'm going to paste the actual API key. All right? So I can save this information, the authentication, into a connection, and now I can reuse it. I'm going to click create, and then notice the connection information is now here. So what I can do, I don't need to pass this to this card anymore. So I can delete this, I can save, right? And I can run this again. All right, and it works the same way, but now the information is now pulled from the connection. All right, and so if there is another flow where you want to call this API, you don't need to set up this key. You can just use the existing connection, right? And just to show you quickly, if I go back to my folders or the folder, and then you go to connections. This has all the connections that you created, right? So for example, if you remember, I had two for Okta, right? So these are the I use with the pre-built connector, and then the ship engine. Let's see if I find it. So this is the one that I just created. I searched for it, so this is the one that I created. So again, if you needed to, you could create multiple connections to the ship engine API. All right. So this is the third option, right? So we use the pre-built connector, the very first one, pre-built connector, pre-built action. Second was we use the custom API action on a pre-built connector. And then the third option is now we use the API connector card. And again, that's what I said, it's kind of confusing. There's so many terms with the word connector or connection. But in the third example, we connected to just a third-party API that's not available out of the box, right? And then we simplified it a little bit. In a sense, we save the connection information separately, and then we can reuse it, right? So before I jump into the fourth example, I see there's some questions. So let me just let me look at the questions quickly from Dmitry. So I've created an API connection for Decobo, and I think hopefully I'm pronouncing it correctly, that utilizes OAuth authentication. But I've noticed that the connection needs to be reauthorized every 14 days. What would be the most effective automation method for handling this? Do I need to use a connector builder? So, okay, so the question is, how do I handle the reauthorization of a connection every 14 days in this particular case? So as far as I know, and again, this is going to be different for every connection. Okta Workflows takes care of getting a new token. If that's if that's the question, it will automatically get a new token. If that doesn't happen, again, for some APIs it might not work. One option I've seen is that you do reauthorize yourself. You build logic and you reauthorize yourself every some number of days. In this particular, it's 14 days. So that's one option to do that. The connector builder. So the automatic reauthorization or the automatic getting the API, the new token, works for workflows, and it works the same way in the connector builder. So if the API, for some reason, if that mechanism doesn't work, it might not work in the connector builder. So it might not help. So the connector builder will also need to have some logic to handle to get a new token. But this is just at a very high level. I think it would, we would need to look closely at the connector, at the API, and see what happens. But again, just to summarize, many APIs, the refresh will be done automatically. But for those that it doesn't happen, yes, you would need to add some logic to handle that. So let's see if there's one from Rebecca. When would you want to create additional connection for an app that is already connected? If you have different environments, if you have a test environment, you could have a connection to test environment. You have a production environment, separate connection, and maybe a development environment. So those are some of the examples when you would create a separate connection. But of course, that's optional. Dmitry, thank you for sharing the API, the link. I'm gonna check it out after the meetup. And then, yeah, feel free to send me an email. I'll share my email, the slide again at the end, and then yeah, we can check it out sort of offline. All right, but I know we have just a few minutes left, and so the last option is building a connector in the connector builder. And so, oh, I opened the same folder. Sorry, let me go back. And so, I really love using the Ship Engine API, right? And I use it a lot. And I decided, you know what, I don't want to use the API connector card every single time. I want to make it even more straightforward. And so what I did is I created a connector in the connector builder for the Ship Engine API, right? And this is now how it looks, is that I don't see the endpoint anymore, right? All I just pass in the input, right? And then it just works like it becomes kind of a pre-built connector. If I run this, all right, that's what I get. I get the same thing. The address is validated. Of course, I do need to have a connection to the connector, same as with any other connectors. But again, what I did here is that I built a connector for the Ship Engine API in the connector builder. And let me show you how it looks. So I'm going to open the connector builder. And this is the connector builder project. And there are settings and there is authentication. But what I love is that you build the connector using flows and cards like you build flows. So there's really nothing new you have to learn. So let me show you one of them. This is the HTTP helper flow. So this is a flow that helps with the HTTP request, right? I'm not going to go over this, but as you can see, these are just using the same cards you would build a regular flow to build a connector builder, right? There are several system flows that the connector requires, like the HTTP helper flow. There is the auth ping flow. This flow runs every time you load a flow. If you sometimes notice that it will check the connection, it will kind of check if the connection is active. And so that's what this flow does. When you open a flow with the connector, it will ping that connector and check, hey, is the connection valid? Okay. But yeah, and then if I go here, if I search for post office, right? So this is my connector, and it has two actions. It has validate, the one we're using here, and then also the custom API action. So if you decide not to create an action for all the API points, you can have this action, and then that will allow the end users to really use any endpoint that's available. So, but that's the fourth example, right? Creating a connector in the connector builder, all right? Now, so the last thing is, when would you use and which one? So, of course, if there is a built-in connector, use it, right? Absolutely. If it misses an action, then use the custom API action to call the endpoint that you need. If there is an API that's just not available in the list of pre-built connectors, then use the API connector card, right? I would say for most cases, either built-in or the API connector card is what you should be using. When would you build a connector? Is that when you want to productize the sort of the API, right? If you want to make it even more straightforward, if perhaps your team or the people who are building flows, don't have a lot of experience setting up APIs, so you want to make it straightforward for them, so you can create a connector, and as I said, kind of a productize that API, make it even more straightforward for them to use it, right? So they don't need to worry about the setting up the query and whatever else is required, right? So I would say 95% of times you would use the built-in or set up using the API connector card. And then for the 5% or so, you could look into building a connector in the connector builder, right? One thing I also say is that in the connector builder, there are currently two deployment options. There's private deployment, which is the connector is only available to your org, right? There's also a public one, and that's gonna the connector is going to be available to everyone who's using workflows. Okay, so those are the two deployment options that are available. All right. All right. So let me go back. Let me put the slide up. All right. So yeah, Dimitri, my email is in the first column, so feel free to send me more information, but I'll check out the link that you shared. But that's all I wanted to cover. I hope this makes a little bit more sense with all the connectors and the connection connectors. I know it was confusing for me, but hopefully kind of again, it's a little bit more straightforward to understand. And yeah, feel free to send me an email with any questions. We have more online meetups. We have a monthly getting started online meetup. It's every second Tuesday of the month. So just go to our Crowdcast channel, and in fact, in the upper, I think it's in the upper right, follow our channel, and then you'll be notified when we go live. But I'll wait a little bit, some seconds here. If you have any questions, please post them. But if not, thank you for joining today. All right. Thank you, Rebecca. I hope this was again helpful, and I will see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.